We have to turn this.
Hello?
I saw Anna Kendrick say that people want to be entertained, so we're going to talk about AI and pharma marketing. There's nothing more entertaining than that. So hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'd like to introduce myself and then turn it over to my co-presenter, Luke. My name is David Ream. I work for IQVIA, the largest provider of healthcare data globally. I work in a business unit called IQVIA Digital, and we are focused on providing data mostly for pharma marketing activities, both HCP and DTC. So, and I've been doing pharma marketing for 30 plus years. So, Luke, you want to go next?
Sure, thanks Dave, and thanks everyone for being here. So I'm part of a group called IQVIA Applied AI Science, so perfect fit for this conversation. My group is basically looking at sort of the innovative side of AI and what we can do. We have a background that spans all kinds of application areas. We'll probably get into some of it today. Just to give you one example, in the UK, there's the National Health Service, which manages all health data across the United Kingdom. And we developed something called NHS Pet, which is a privacy-enhancing technology. Just to give you one example of sort of the different kinds of things we work on. My background myself, though, is regulatory. I worked in privacy-enhancing technology, but also AI. I worked for a privacy commissioner decade ago now. So I've been working in the AI space, but also the regulatory side of that for quite a long time.
So the format of this is we decided to ask each other questions. We work together, but we're in separate groups. And so we put together questions for each other, which we are going to have on our phones. And then we realized we can both barely read our phones. So there's going to be a lot of this going on. So please put up with us. We're going to have a discussion, but please, if you'd like to join, just raise your hand or stand up and start yelling. We'd love to have your point of view or to follow up on questions. But if nobody does, we're just gonna ramble on. So the first question I have for you, I'm going to turn my chair a little bit towards you. The first question I have for you, Luke, is when we go to these things like South by Southwest, everybody's talking about the potential of AI. Let's start a little bit differently. What disappoints you about AI?
I'll admit it's a bit of a tough question. So I think back to, I'm old enough now to say, Back to the Future, hoverboards. Still don't have hoverboards realistically. So when I think of AI, I think there's been a lot of hype. And I don't want to say disappointed, but there are still some gaps. So we've reached a time now where we can start, AI can talk to us, which is pretty cool. So thinking 2001 Space Odyssey. So that I'm excited by it, but also at the same time seeing we're still sort of in that hype cycle where things are still changing. We're still trying to figure out, okay, it's really cool, things like large language models, but where exactly are they going to take us? I think there's still some uncertainty there. We'll probably get into more of that later. The other thing I think is I'm seeing, because of the hype, of course, we're all super excited. We use this broad term AI to mean all kinds of things. And people are kind of throwing it everywhere, right? And so given my regulatory background, of course, I do sometimes worry and wonder about how it's being used. Is it being used effectively? Is it being used in a way that doesn't breach certain protocols we currently have from a governance or a security perspective? And then lastly, the big thing I think about is scale as well, right? It's one thing to talk about, one little application or, all the talk around DeepSeek, for example, for those who are familiar, where it's like, massive amounts of infrastructure to run, a basic question. I think you told me earlier it was something like $100,000 a month for some of these newer models just to get access to them, which might be amazing. I don't know. I haven't had a chance to work with those scale. But I do wonder about how we're going to scale that in a way that is effective, but also very responsible in how it's being used.
Yeah. Great. I think the thing that disappoints me about AI from kind of a different perspective is I was around when the internet was first rolling out in pharma and to use it as pharma marketing. And I kind of think of myself as a technologist. My undergrad degree was in computer science. And when the internet rolled out, I could understand it. Like the underlying protocol is the HTTP protocol. I could read that and understand it, even though I had kind of one foot in technology and one foot in marketing. The thing I find challenging about the AI environment is it feels fairly inscrutable to me. I don't really understand it, even though I've studied it, you know. And again, I'm probably more of a marketer these days than a technologist. But, you know, I know this is not a new thing that was invented last week. This builds on decades of work with neural networks and building up, you know, to bigger and bigger models. But if you look at stuff like, you know, like diffusion models, like I totally don't follow that. I don't understand what's going on. So therefore, I feel like I'm more at, you know, kind of a user level than a practitioner level. And I think, how is pharma going to understand this? You know, because again, we both touch on regulatory a lot. Everybody in this room probably deals with regulatory. So I think, God, we're putting together these super complex things. How are the regulatory folks going to be able to process this? So my main thing is I find it very hard to understand what's going on, you know, other than at the very surface level. The other kind of smaller pet peeve I have is the phrase AI, because as you know, AI is not a thing. You know, AI is a category of technologies. So machine learning, large language models, small language models, NLP, you know, stuff like that. So when people say AI, it also has that kind of buzz to me where people just shove things into definitions and say AI enabled or whatever. Like, well, what do you mean by AI enabled? Like, what exactly are you doing? And I feel like that's where AI is it's a little bit, you know, a little bit in that hype cycle area where just saying AI is not really that helpful. You know?
Yeah, can I follow up on
Yeah,
that?
sure.
Yeah, okay. So how many people here know what a linear regression is? Okay, fair number. How many people have looked at the math behind a large language model? Ooh, nice. Okay, my people. Yeah, so I mean, that's the problem, right? So I come from an engineering, then math, then statistics background. So similarly, when you think of it from a regulatory perspective, if I'm going to do something with data, I'm going to draw insights in some way, and I'm going to give it to a regulator, then yeah, I'm going to go more the classical statistical side because I want to see those confidence intervals. I want to be able to say with clear, you know, documentation, hey, this does this, and here's the boundaries in which it operates, right? It gets more challenging. So there's sort of two schools of thought. There's the classical, which I'll admit I'm in both worlds. There's the more like, yeah, but it's a black box. It's okay. Let's just do like we do with drugs where we don't always understand every single mechanism, but at the same time we can say, look, if we test it well, then maybe that's okay. So the reason I asked about linear regression, for example, is when you start breaking down some of these things like neural nets, realistically you can almost think of each of those nodes in a neural net as a linear regression. Now, to me, that was like mind-blowing when I first sort of figured that out, and I looked at the math, I looked at what they're doing, and I went, oh, that's basically a logistic regression here, a ReLU there, and I'm like, oh, okay, I get it now. These are just a bunch of regressions. But when you think about the math behind that, I mean, that's kind of wild. You've got these networks with like maybe 100 nodes, and how you structure those nodes and how it then connects pieces of information, how you randomize it will totally change how good it is for a particular application. So when we talk about large language models, obviously I can't trace every single thing. That's the explainability you talked about, which can make it very challenging. But what I can do is I can think of it from that sort of, me personally at least, I think of it from that perspective of, oh, okay, it's sort of like a bunch of linear regressions. So it's, and you look at some of the math, it's basically a big correlation matrix. So I'm taking this sentence and that sentence, and I'm saying, how well related are these two? How correlated are they? And so when you start thinking that way, you can start finding applications where large language models, as an example, really fit the problem I'm trying to solve. And I've built some systems, my team have built systems where that's how we came at it. And then there are others that are more, you know, sort of on the front line of, okay, well, let's try and guess, you know, get the system to guess what might be correlated, what I may be trying to do. And that's why when you use something like, you know, one of these online systems, Claude or ChatGPT, you ask it a question like, I didn't understand what Dave was asking me the other day, and it'll literally start predicting what you might have intended by that. Like it's pretty cool, but it's correlation. It's a big correlation engine, basically.
Yeah. Just to riff on that a little bit, you know, I think a lot of things we do in marketing, you know, are not math. You know, it's message development and creativity and that kind of stuff. But how do you feel about the assertion that AI is nothing but math? Is there any art in that sauce, or is it just just math?
So although I started in engineering, I went into math, and so I'm, obviously very tied to the math side. But I'm going to say it's a bit of both because, first of all, it's almost like the computer scientists really nailed it with the marketing, right? They took math, we call it a linear regression, you turn around and say, no, dude, it's machine learning, right? I mean, it's just, brilliant. All the terms that are used, but also the creativity behind it. So you take something that's very mathematical, I can write the equations, I can show the confidence intervals, I can build things around it. And then you take that and you go, okay, but how am I going to actually do this really quickly? Like terabytes of data. Then you've got algorithms. And then you take those algorithms and say, yeah, but if I think of it this way, if I think of this like a neural piece, one neuron that I'm going to maybe, and they start chaining it together and they do wicked things like, I'm going to create a bunch of neurons that are in a circle. I'm going to create neurons that are in a diamond shape. And they run experiments and whoa, it actually does something very specific very well. So I think there is art to it. Yes, it's all backed up in math. And some of that math we can't trace and give to the regulator and say exactly the confidence intervals around everything it's doing. But at the same time, there's a creativity in how we're taking these ideas, chaining them together, and really pushing insights.
Right. Okay. Great. So I came into IQVIA through the acquisition of a fairly small company, and we were not big enough to do any R&D. We didn't have R&D. One of the interesting things about being in a company as big as IQVIA is they have a robust R&D area, which you're more tapped into than I. Not in a promotional way, but can you share some of the things that IQVIA is looking into with applying AI?
Oh, wow. That's a big ask. There's a lot that we're doing. Everything I just mentioned, IQVIA has been in the AI space for a long time. Again, if we didn't really cover that, but what do we mean by AI, be it machine learning, whatever. Even in the area of natural language processing, now large language models, the group that I work with have been doing that for 15, 20 years, right? So we actually have a system that we built before we were really framing it as a large language model. It's called a BERT model, for those who are familiar, for regulatory submissions, right? We actually built a system and it was being productized and used. And then large language models came out, obviously, in my opinion, hugely democratized. My sisters are using it, and they're not in the tech space, so it's really opened it up. So we're working in all those areas, including basic machine learning, whatever, the scalability, the size, et cetera, but all the way up to, okay, how do we use large language models? And now, for those who are familiar, the concept of agentic AI, which is basically agents, which are, you can think of them basically as large language models that are specifically trained for a task, and then you have a whole bunch of these that then coordinate across each other. We're doing that as well.
Great. I think you have a question.
I have a question for you, yeah. So I'm not on the marketing side, so I'm going to ask a question that probably a lot of people here know, but maybe you can draw out some insights that they won't know because I don't know either. So I hear the term, and I've looked on the website, the IQVIA digital website, and I hear the term omni-channel. And I kind of get the idea, but I'm also a bit fascinated, one from the AI side, but also from the regulatory side. I'm assuming omni-channel means like all kinds of different data, right, from different areas. And I'm curious how that happens and how you actually coordinate, given that you're going to have so many different kinds of data, and then also the silos that exist. It's really at the forefront of what we're doing, so I'm kind of curious as to how you guys are doing that.
Yeah, and actually I think the future of it ties into kind of what you were just mentioning, and I'll try to tie those two a little together. Well, omnichannel is a confusing term, unfortunately, because there's a lot of definitions of it. The two broadest definitions are obviously omni, meaning all, and all channels. So it depends on how you look at it. So if you pull all the way back, you can look at different channels like mass media, like broadcast television and radio, and then digital and face-to-face. That can be omni-channel. Although many people, especially in my circle, refer to omni-channel as just meaning across digital channels. So that could be, doing ads on websites versus ads on social media versus email pushes or that kind of stuff. So basically across the digital channels. And when we talk about omni-channel marketing, what we're really trying to do is take something learned in one channel and leverage it to another channel, right? So if we send an email to a doctor and it's about efficacy, and they open that, we might think, oh, that person's interested in efficacy. So let's share that with the advertising group that's activating ads for HCPs and have them use the efficacy creative when they're presenting in front of that individual, right? And so, again, back to our kind of data and math kind of thing, each of those channels are generating its own engagement data, whether that's clicks or views or whatever, and that data can be shared with other channels kind of in real time. So what occurs to me, over the last 6 months is that we could create agents that manage each channel. And those channels, another thing we worry about is kind of governance, right? Because you don't want something to become illegal in terms of data sharing or something. So each channel might have its own governance and its own agent responsible for that channel. And then they work together to exchange information and build new personas or activation campaigns that we as the marketers may not even originally design. They may see, again, we anthropomorphize, and they don't see, but they may have access to all this data and create near real-time combinations of them and actions taken that we as the marketers don't originally design, which of course has benefits and negatives to it also.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Let me see. I think I have another question. When we do something like create a consumer audience, which we have to do for DTC advertising, we worry a lot about certain regulatory issues and specifically re-identification, right? Because the current data privacy laws is that if you use a sensitive personal information like health data to create an audience that you're going to market to, you need to have consent to do that. And largely consent doesn't exist in the consumer side of it. So because we don't have consent, we in order to stay compliant, we go through the loophole of de-identification. So they often say you can use the data if it's de-identified, right? So we have this whole dance to make it de-identified and then to use probabilistic methods of creating an audience that introduce noise that make it hard to re-identify any individual. So as you may know, there's been a lot of academic work that shows even if you de-identify a person, if you add in enough other data sets, you raise the chance that you can re-identify that person, right? So our regulatory groups worry about that a lot. Our lawyers worry about that a lot, obviously. So this re-identification is real key, a thing we worry about. You've spoken to me recently and used the phrase AI attacks. And I don't really know what that means. So what are we going to have to worry about as we employ more AI into this already kind of problematic condition that we have of trying to not violate anybody's personal privacy?
Yeah, and to tie back to your omni-channel discussion, I mean, that's the beauty of having the agents separated out that way, right? You're creating sort of a federated approach for people who are familiar with like federated learning, or I could kind of see the parallel there. So the challenge is there's a couple different ways. I don't know what the context was when we talked about it because we've talked about a lot of stuff, but there's a few different challenges. One is basically the concept that, hey, you've got all these, again, using the broad term of AI, these systems that are maybe feeding on a lot of information. So when you introduce them to a data set, they may already have training data, things that they inherently have trained on and can connect, infer between different types of data. And you put it on a data set and it's finding now more information and saying, oh, I can actually connect that to something I know over here. About a decade ago when I worked for the Privacy Commissioner's Office, there was something similar happening even with online searches. You could find things like a publication ban because there was something happened in court and there was a child involved, basically. But you could do certain queries in certain ways that you would start to find connections and potentially reveal the identity of the child whose name you're not supposed to be, not supposed to know and wasn't mentioned. Now imagine adding a large language model, and there have been studies about a year and a half ago. There was a good publication. There's the first, I haven't seen any since, but that was the first one I saw, that took all the knowledge, all the training that it had in large language model, applied it, and started showing how not only does it inherently know a ton because it's collecting all kinds of information across the web. We're talking, the large language models that we know, right? So obviously they're trained on a lot of internet information. But then you then add extra data, and it's literally tying things together you did not anticipate. I de-identified it over here, I de-identified it over there, but when I bring them together, it's making those, again, it's a great correlation engine, right? This sentence and that sentence. And so they were able to show all kinds of measures and metrics to show that it's actually making that connection. So that's one side of it. The other side is sometimes called AI security, which is another area I work in, which is now looking at the AI itself and saying, oh, okay, maybe I've taken care of that. I have trained it on the right data, I've kept silos, I have control so that people in my organization only use it for certain applications and with certain types of data. Maybe we're talking about agents that are trained on specific data sets, so they're not cross-contaminated. Okay, great. But the AI itself is at risk of new methods to attack the AI, right? We saw this, I probably shouldn't say any specific public examples, but people might be familiar with Tay, which was an online chatbot, and people were poisoning Tay to become racist, essentially. Okay, so not exactly re-identification, but it's just an example of how you can, manipulate, right? But even like a machine learning, we've known this for a long time, like regressions, for example. There's all kinds of literature about how you can learn things even from a regression, and depending how much you disclosed about that regression, you could actually start to tease out information you thought was aggregated and simplified in the regression itself, right? I wrote a paper, I think it was, I don't want to say, maybe 15 years ago now, that went into some of these like cryptographic methods, and if you didn't, basically balance the data and balance the aggregations you were doing, you could reveal things from the data you thought was all aggregated and simplified in a regression. So the attacks on AI have become more pronounced, let's say, but again, just to simplify, so we had, the attacks on the data, and now we have attacks on the AI. So depending where in the value chain, what you're looking at, there are risks at both ends of the spectrum, basically.
Yeah. You make me think of just tying a couple of those points together. I talked about even when you de-identify data to a HIPAA compliant level or state compliant level, academics have shown if you add in enough other data sources, you can start to build a prediction algorithm to re-identify those people, right? But one thing I just occurred to me listening to you is nothing is better at incorporating more data than AI type systems, right? That's the whole thing they do, incorporate and make correlations, right? And so one of the things I could see that we don't worry about now is there's things like, the four pillars that we look at is designing advertising campaigns, creating audiences for advertising campaigns, activating those campaigns, and then measurement of those campaigns. But on the measurement side, what we do is we get exposure data. So these online identifiers have seen, this particular ad. What occurs to me is that instead of having academics try to guess it, if we wanted to re-identify that person, instead of having academics try to guess what other data sets can I add in and how can I do this correlation, seems like that might be something an AI system could do very easily and quickly. So what if we show an online identifier to this kind of a system, and then they said, hey, that was John Smith correlated with that ID, and based on this exposure data, John has a 73% chance of having psoriasis. Now psoriasis probably not a big deal, but when you're talking about HIV or ED or other things like that, it could become very problematic, which could of course lead to litigation, which is what we're all trying to really avoid. But I can see that, like you said, things can attack the AI, but AI could also attack kind of our current way of doing stuff in a bad actor kind of way, you know. So I think that's interesting.
How many people here are familiar with Mad Magazine?
Mad Magazine.
Right? Pretty cool, right? So it makes me think, because I actually bought a copy at the airport on the way here.
No, they still have Mad Magazine?
Yeah, they had a special issue, a special edition. So if you see in the airport, you can pick it up. And it was Spy versus Spy. And I couldn't believe it. I was so excited.
The
I picked it up.
favorite.
It's like, 100 pages. I bought it for my kids, but I also bought it for myself, quite frankly. But that's kind of what it is. I made the analogy like 5 years ago about this exact concept of spy versus spy. You've got AI that is being developed to protect data, right? So maybe we can talk about some of the mathy, geeky stuff if people are interested. But there are ways to anonymize, to protect data. But then there's this AI that is being used and should be. I mean, we should be developing these things to test it out, but it becomes a spy versus spy. But I want to ask you a question as well, kind of tie it back, because you mentioned consumer audiences. You then mentioned exposure data. I love that term, by the way. It makes me think of like revealing, exposure. I hadn't heard that. It's
a little bit that way.
Okay, yeah, it's kind of interesting. Yeah. But how is AI being used across all of these now? Like with, you mentioned the agents approach, but now you're talking about consumer data in particular, and then the measurement piece that ties in. How is AI play into that?
So creating audiences for consumer marketing is much more complex than HCP marketing, because generally we want to create an audience that has a tendency to respond. And so on consumer, that would be they're using their personal health data, which we don't use personal health data for the HCP side. We more react to their medical specialty and their prescribing behavior and some of the stuff that's not as well protected in law right now. But for consumers, again, to use their personal health data, you have to either have their consent or you have to be highly de-identified, right? So, you could, so what you can't do is create if somebody wants to do a campaign for type 2 diabetes, you can't go into claims data and just pull out everybody that is on metformin. Right, that's against the law because you don't have consent for that, right? So what we did is we started evolving probabilistic models that for safety more were based on consumer attributes than health data. I think the market generally stayed away from health data. However, about 4 years ago, several suppliers in the area of building consumer audiences started using health data to predict, to build the audience, right? And that's highly predictive. And so those companies that were doing it got a big jump in the quality of the audiences they brought to the market, right? And so again, if you can find a safe way to look at someone's individual health information and use that, then you get a very predictive audience. About 2 years ago, IQVIA looked at that process of adding in health data. We decided that for us, there was too much risk in that. We felt too much risk for us, but also for our clients. And while other people were doing it in various models, we looked at those models and we didn't judge it, comfortable enough. So, and a lot of that is using machine learning, to look at health data and to build predictive models. So we weren't comfortable doing that. So we didn't introduce that in our consumer audience building. However, what we've been working on with your group in large regard is to say, hey, can we go back to this idea of using personal health data, but in a way that's much more auditable in its safety than other techniques that we saw. And so your team has helped us develop a lot of math. And again, we get back to math, a lot of ways to change a person's health data so that we still get some predictive value out of that, but we really minimize the risk of ever mapping it back to an individual. And those techniques are part of this toolbox of AI that we see out there. And so we're feeling more comfortable about using personal health data in creating consumer audiences that are a safe method of doing it, but still add in that better quality of the audience.
Right. And this might be a totally stupid question, by the way. Does this tie back at all into the omni-channel stuff? Or is DTC and measurement, that's really the space where it kind of, you're pulling in the AI?
Yeah, generally when people talk about omni-channel, I mean, they have to create an audience for each channel, right? And so often the audiences will vary slightly between channels because, you know, if you have an email address or you have a household that you can reach with connected television or something, you different parameters. But the techniques are basically the same in creating an audience, okay? I think I have the next question. I've heard the phrase inside of IQVIA of defensible AI, and I don't know what that means. Can you tell me what defensible AI is?
Yeah, sure. So my team, we came up with the term, I don't know, probably about a year ago to describe some of the work that we're doing. So across the board, we want to make sure the AIs that we build are defensible. And I mean it from a very broad perspective. I think sometimes it gets interpreted mostly from, when I mentioned my privacy commissioner background, kind of interpreted from a very regulatory, we want to make sure it's defensible, explainability, ethics, responsible use of AI security, that kind of stuff. But I actually mean even broader than that, because it's got to be defensible, to me, sort of between three groups. It's your internal group, of course, because you tell your boss, hey, I'm building an AI system. Well, he has to be convinced it's useful. He's got to be convinced that it's responsible. You mentioned, some parameters around health data, for example, same kind of thing, right? But then you got to explain it to your clients, and then you got to explain it possibly to the FTC, right? So all of these require different conversations, right? Different aspects. So in some cases, it might be, if you're submitting something to the FDA, well, then we're talking we call, I don't know if everyone calls it this, but we call it regulatory grade. If it's to scientific publication where you're using real-world data, well, very different ask there, then it's going to be scientific grade. Why are they different? Well, because the regulatory side, for those who are perhaps not familiar, you're really talking about things like good clinical practice, like traceability of every single change of the data to show that it wasn't manipulated. Everything was done, it's documented, it's controlled, et cetera. Whereas scientific, it's more about, okay, well, here's where we got the data from. Here are the parameters of the data. It was real world, so we don't know, but we know it was collected at the time they went to the hospital, for example. Like, it's a very different sort of thing. And you get into issues of data quality. Big fact, which is true for all AI ultimately, but it's a matter of how much defensibility you need, right? And if you have an application that's very, very sensitive, the FTC's, they got their eyes on it, then defensibility comes from the privacy side, in my case, or unfair practices. So the ethical piece, the responsible piece, how do you build that? So IQVIA, for its own systems, uses the term healthcare grade AI to describe that, and you can kind of think of it as the data, the AI, and the experts that are working on that. And all of that is, the foundation of it is going to be defensible as well, right? Defensible AI, defensible data.
And when you mean defensible, you mean defensible to like regulatory action and litigation and?
That's one of them for sure. But it could even be, I mean it from a very broad perspective. I mean, we work with all kinds of teams and they'll say, yeah, but what is that? I can't just say, oh, don't worry about it. Close your eyes. It's a large language model. You don't need to know. No, I have to justify. I got to show them validation. So for anyone who's looked at, like, the FDA had put out, I think it was in January, they put out a draft guidance around AI credibility. So they modeled it off of other device credibility where you have to show the validation of the system itself. Because they want to make sure that if you're using it for, let's say, think back to the medical device, AI as a medical device, right? You don't want this to kill someone. You don't want it to, in the case of like a large language model, you don't want it to hallucinate and make things up. Oh, they need an injection of this drug now. No, they don't. So it really depends on the context. So I use it quite broadly when I describe it, but it's that defensibility of it.
I assume when you say things like healthcare grade and regulatory grade and scientific grade, those are all real things, right? That you consider.
It's terms that I've heard within IQVIA, so I don't know if other people use these terms.
My question is, have you ever heard of marketing grade?
No. Is that a thing?
Well, we should work on that,
Okay.
because I'm sure many people here are marketers, and marketing is the same bucket as it's different, but there's scientific and regulatory. Marketing has certain needs, and I would encourage us to work on marketing, defining marketing grade AI too.
On that too, I'll say this is where, for those who are familiar with like data quality frameworks, for example, it always talks about it being tailored. So you would have, in your case of marketing grade, whatever that is defined as, you might look at, EMA guidance on quality and make it specific to your needs, right? It's not going to be the same for everyone.
Let me build on that and say that whenever we take a new data-driven product to pharma, we have to go through their privacy review, which varies a lot from manufacturer to manufacturer. But there's lawyers and privacy specialists and that kind of thing, and they're looking at issues of consent and legal compliance and these other things. With more AI coming into marketing and things like creating audiences and that kind of stuff, do you have any feeling, like if you were at a manufacturer and someone came to you with a AI-based marketing program, what additional new kinds of questions would you be asking or require from that vendor who may be presenting to them?
So it really comes, for me, looking at it from that defensible AI perspective, it's going to come down to the use case as well. So do you have a particular use case in mind or just in general?
Let's say creating consumer audiences, because we've been talking about that.
Okay. Yeah, so the sensitivity of it's going to determine how many controls you have around it, right? It's no different than an FDA, a drug or something, right? The more sensitive it is, or the more closely it's related to patient safety, patient outcomes, clearly. So a lot of these things come down to the responsible application of it, but also in terms of, if we're talking about, for example, consumer audiences, you mentioned a couple of years ago they started using health data. Well, the question is how, right? So that's going to be hugely important. So from an AI perspective, obviously data quality, but it's also, if it's not consent, then how are you using this data? What's an appropriate way to do that? So documenting all that, but also having strong, robust guardrails around it. I mean, a lot of this stuff, some of it is documentation. I'm a technologist. I don't want to spend time writing documentation. So I look at it from a tech perspective. What can I build? And that's what I would ask. If I was looking at this, I'd be asking for, well, how do you validate this? How do you ensure it's responsible and trustworthy? Those are some sort of keywords that people throw around a lot.
And I'm going to go back to our very early discussion about where I am disappointed with AI and how sort of inscrutable it is. And again, I had mentioned being around when we were rolling out internet for the first time. And I remember thousands of conversations about showing people websites for the first time. But as weird as that was at the time, and of course we all totally live on that now, it was relatively easy to understand. You click on this thing, right? You click your mouse on this thing right here, and then you'll go to another page, right? That was really like the core of it. So it was pretty easy to understand. With AI, it's very complex. It's very hard to understand. And I'm wondering if especially manufacturers, pharma manufacturers, are going to start having to hire people on the regulatory side that understand more than a little, probably more than I know, in order to be able to push back on vendors or agencies and say, hey, this isn't quite good enough. Maybe we're in that grace period right now where nobody, everybody's pushing the envelope, but very few people are saying, hey, is the envelope going too fast? Which is kind of the role of manufacturers in a lot of cases.
So you get me a little bit excited because it makes me think of two things. Because first of all, when I worked for the Prize Commission, that was my job. I was a director of a technology team. And so we were brought in so that we could inform the commissioner, investigators, et cetera, on technology. So technology questions, you'd get a question at 7 p.m. at night, you'd have to get in there and start responding because of media requests, right? That was always a big driver, and it will be for any big, government agency. How do you respond to this? So yes, I think, yes, on the one hand, absolutely, you need to have people who are knowledgeable enough to read the literature. I mean, we're not talking about all the math, obviously, but at least know enough to say what the guardrails should be. But on the flip side, I've been a big proponent for a long time. There was a book called Weapons of Math Destruction, written a long time ago. Forget how long ago now, maybe a decade. But when I first saw it, the first thing, when I started reading it, I'm like, this is basically, to me, biostatistics, right? Because we have a lot of these guardrails already, right? So two things. One, if it's a human, I don't expect to crack open your brain and look at all the regressions inside your head, right? I expect to just say, here are the guardrails. I expect to see validation, your decision making. Why'd you do this? Well, because we have this framework, we follow it this way, right? That makes sense. So from an AI perspective, it is exactly that. It's, can you prove to me? It's not always that I have to understand every detail, because the technology is changing very fast. Oh, diffusion model versus something. It doesn't matter. It's what are the guardrails, and how can you prove to me certain aspects of that? Could be validation, it could be testing. Again, going back, I think I made the analogy earlier of drug development, right? We have ways to do that. Biostatistics, ethical, approaches have existed for a long time, and a lot of the guardrails we talk about on the machine learning side, to me, they're being relearned, because we already did this in the healthcare space in the biostatistical side of things. Anyway, that's my perspective.
So just to summarize that, you think transparency is important?
Well, I mean, they're going to mandate it, right? If it's going to affect a patient, of course, the FDA, for example, but even the FTC, if they're looking at it, they're going to say, hey, explain to me what you're doing. Right? And that there might be some technologists involved, depending on the circumstance, but my experience, even as the technologist working with investigators, was that, at the end of the day, it's the investigator who is not a technologist, right? They know enough, but they want to understand. So you have to be prepared to explain that, oh, look, we have this, I'll call it, for lack of a better term, biostatistician that wrote this report. Here's all the confidence intervals, here's all the testing we did. And they're not going to look at the specifics, but they're going to go, okay, I'll maybe send that to my tech team. You explain to me X, Y, and Z. So, document it. But having the guardrails and strong validation will be necessary for that. Again, that's my opinion as a technologist. But can I ask you a question and flip it around?
There's a hand up.
Exciting.
Our first question. We're very excited.
Do you want me to use the mic, or can I just
Mike?
I can hear you.
Oh, there's one there. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, they're recording. They probably need the mic.
Yeah.
There we go. Hey.
Yeah.
Thank you all for your conversation. My name is JB. I'm a student at Harvard studying AI and tech policy, AI governance. Luke, you mentioned one thing that I was pretty interested to sort of delve in a bit more. So you lightly touched upon AI agents, and I'm taking a course called Agentic AI, and one of the things that we're sort of seeing with a lot of these new AI agents is that the creators of these AI agents are getting just about as close to labeling them something, but getting just stopping just short of it. So for example, an AI agent that might work in a nursing home, and they're not calling it like a nurse aide, but they're basically saying it can do everything that a nurse aide could do, but don't call it a nurse aide. Or your AI agentic attorney, but it's not an attorney. So just getting close to the line, but kind of pulling back. And so I'm curious as to how you see this being regulated in the future, if these products are going to require some sort of licensing that's similar to a licensing that a nurse might receive, or comparable to passing the bar, for lack of another comparison. Because it seems as though if you're going to give it this professionalism moniker, there should be a higher standard of expectation in terms of liability.
Ooh, great question. Do you want me to take that first?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
don't understand what he said. So. Good thing.
So a couple things. So there are, and you're probably aware of this, but for those as well, just to be aware, standards bodies are starting to develop some of these. And now it takes a long time to develop standards. I'm part of a standards body as well. It took us 5 years to get a standard, because it's like working with the UN. You got everyone in the world giving opinions and perspectives, which is great, but it just takes a lot longer to create alignment and get everything worked out. But for example, there's one on AI management system, which is a quality management system, but it sits on top of a quality management system that's specific to AI. It covers the main principles of always looking at these risks and impacts, feeding back learnings back to the effectiveness of the AI. So you're going to have that. But your question goes further, because and they haven't really, from what I've seen, I haven't seen anything that's specific to agentic yet. There are some tools that are being developed. But in terms of, again, this is purely my opinion from a defensibility standpoint, absolutely. If you're going to have something replace a nurse, we already have good training and guardrails and methods that we would just apply to the agent, right? We would say, hey, I expect you to have this training and this knowledge. Great. But then also the practice will have to be governed in the same way we govern in any space, right? We don't let lawyers run amok. They have, ethical responsibilities. They have certain guardrails, checks and balances. People can say, hey, I'm going to submit, okay, watching popular television and everything, but nonetheless, you can submit a complaint about a lawyer, like this is unethical, et cetera. I think you'll see the same things start to emerge, depending how much human or expert in the loop is removed from that. For now, the systems that we're building, and we are involved in some of this, building these real systems, we have an expert in the loop, right? Because we're not at the stage yet where we just say, just do it and I'm going to turn a blind eye. We're not there yet. We're working on, even within IQVIA, we're working on the guardrails that are necessary, but they're always tailored to the specific application, which I think is appropriate, like nursing, like law, right? They're different, and so you have to tailor your guardrails to that particular instance. So I think it's going to mean a lot of governance. What might be really exciting in the future, though, which I think is different from the human aspect, right, is that some of those guardrails might be much more rigorous in a sense, because there's a whole area developed around provable guarantees, right, which is very interesting. We're still in the early days, but I think those are also going to provide, those guaranteed, it's going to act in this way, it's going to stay within these boundaries, but it's an evolving area. But I do agree with you. I think you're going to see it follow the same patterns you see in other professions, essentially.
I think also, just taking the pharma marketing viewpoint, is that, we have for many years balanced risk versus effectiveness, right? And the way I think about it is, first, the lowest level is legal and regulatory risk. And you certainly don't want to do anything that is clearly against the law, right? You'll end up in jail. So as an example that we've mentioned a couple times here, you can't use a person's personal health data without their consent, right? So that's kind of the baseline. But then there's this loophole, unless it's de-identified, right? And that's what I think of as the gray space. It's not exactly clear on what level of de-identification or probabilistic noise you need to interject to be safe, right? So different companies navigate that gray space in a different way. IQVIA is very conservative, and it said we're not going to add in personal health data when we create audiences. That was just our view of that gray space, right? But then above that, you get corporate level risk profiles, right? So a big thing that happened last year was Washington State's My Health, My Data, which put more of a focus on kind of state level. So IQVIA as a company made a decision to not include any Washington State residents in any consumer models that we built, to go out, which was a fairly common decision. I think that's kind of across everything. I will also note that IQVIA decided to cease recruiting for clinical trials in Washington State, because we're very focused on diversity of clinical trials, and Washington said you couldn't use ethnicity as a criteria, which we basically decided to not do clinical trials in Washington State anymore, which is bad for the people of Washington. But again, going back, so we don't do Washington, which is very common. One of our close partners, and a company known to probably most people in this room, LiveRamp, said, hey, we don't want Nevada residents to go through our system. So since we were pushing so many audiences through their system, we had to exclude Washington and Nevada. But then on top of that, we react on a client by client basis. And I would say the most common thing we see is suppressing Washington, Nevada, and Connecticut, right? But we have had clients come to us with up to 12 states being suppressed, including Florida. And if you take Washington, Nevada, and Connecticut, that's about 2% of the US population. You can survive that. If you suppress Florida and Texas because of their state laws, you're now about a third of the country that you're not reaching. And that starts to really damage the effectiveness of advertising campaigns. So I see this risk as first of all, there's no black and white. There's lots of answers along this continuum. And I think the same thing's going to happen in AI to a more, extensive degree. There's this risk profile around data privacy. Now there's going to be a risk profile about AI, and they may even interact with each other, But I think we're just going to, it's going to get more complicated because each company is going to have to determine their risk profile in a potentially gray space of legal regulatory.
Yeah, I'll just say, because I hope that I didn't give that impression. As a technologist, as someone who, going back a long time, I'm very advocate for privacy and my private information, but I don't want to be asked like these apps that, there was a proposal like 20 years ago, and some people have tried to create these things where you manage your data. I can't be bothered, okay? I just want it to work. just work for me. So I'm an advocate of using AI. I'm an advocate of technology. I don't want to scare people when I talk about AI security or spy versus spy. That's not my intent. To me, when I talk about these things, it's not just the academic, it's the pragmatic, and it's how do you build the systems. We learn from cybersecurity threats. We learn from privacy threats. It's not about stopping, it's about the how, right? How can we innovate? This has been my area. Oh, we have a question. If you're going to grab the mic, that'd be awesome. Yeah. But yeah, just to finish my thought, for me, it's all about using those constraints, those boundaries to innovate. Mm-hmm. Yes, please.
So to jump off that previous question, you mentioned something that piqued my interest, where they were talking about the agentic AI acting as lawyers and nurse aides and stuff like that. Yeah, and you said, oh yeah, you can submit a complaint to a lawyer. A lawyer can be disbarred, a nurse aide can be fired. But let's go back to what you said all the way earlier, where an AI model hallucinates and gives a patient a drug they really should not have gotten. Where does the buck stop with that? Because you could. It's a very real scenario. Someone turns around and says, "Oh well, our model said this, so you're SOL. Sorry." And then there's real damage with that. Where does the responsibility in that? You have these agentic AIs and they're acting as in whatever capacity that they are. Where's the responsibility with that from a, legal compliance regulatory, whatever you want to call it?
Yep. No, great question. I'm not a lawyer. I just play one on TV. But I will say that this is why you're seeing the FDA, for example, put out things like AI credibility. It's literally a risk assessment tool, right? They're doing it to say, we know that things can go wrong. A regression can overestimate if it's not trained properly, if the data is too dispersed, et cetera, right? We know that. The same thing happens with hallucinations, right? So what are the guardrails? What are the validations that we're going to have to impose that when I apply it within this circumstance for this type of treatment, right? And they're going to ask, and I've seen I've looked very closely at this, and we're at the beginning of this, but at the same time, they are getting very stringent in how they're going to validate, how we're going to look at, okay, as long as you operate it within these bounds, it's not going to be any AI. You're not going to take the nurse AI and apply it to this drug. Well, maybe you will in that case. That's probably a bad example. But let's say you had an AI as a medical device or software as a medical device, right? It's going to be tailored to that use case, right? It's not going to be ChatGPT necessarily. It's going to be trained specifically for that task, and they're going to require a lot of validation. The way the FDA has described it already in this draft guidance is they want you to come to them early. The EMA has done the same thing in Europe. They're like, come to us early. We're going to work with you on the validation. So, you're going to see this back and forth. Now, when we talk about agents and stuff, obviously that gets more complicated. So the governance is going to be, and they talk about this as well. They talk about monitoring the risks, monitoring the system to make sure that, if we start getting pharmacovigilance signals that say this is a dangerous drug in these applications, you're going to have to feed that back into the AI and keep monitoring and keep training and keep submitting it back to the FDA to say, hey, here are the guardrails. Oh, we just learned this. And it's not about the AI making a mistake. It's about just in general, there's some new information. Oh, how are we going to evaluate that? How are we going to continue monitoring it? I think a lot of the tools we have already exist, but we have to now make them explicit for this new technology, essentially.
Yeah. Yes, question.
Sorry, thank you very much. I have a question. You're talking about hallucination of AI agents and whatnot, and in some ways, this also emulates real life. Like doctors make mistakes, they have students that make mistakes.
Yep.
But what about from one of the biggest weaknesses I see in AI, like on a daily basis, is the hallucination of also the user itself. Like if you've used any of the AI tools, it thinks you're a genius 24/7 and you always have the smartest answer. But what happens when a patient or whatnot hallucinates their own symptoms or their own injuries or whatnot, and then it causes the AI agent to maybe error in suggested injection? Like obviously, there's got to be validation and accountability. If for a doctor, the buck does have to stop somewhere. But what type of boundary do you see between like the AI, the patient, and the provider at the end? Like, how do we secure that so people can make mistakes, but not go to jail for it?
Yeah, I'm going to jump in before you answer, but it makes me immediately think of the TV show House, if you ever watched it, and his modus operandi was that patients always lie, But it is a really good point. I mean, one of the things that humans do well is, this kind of like vague pattern matching where we can intuit that someone's telling us the truth, but it doesn't seem like AI has that capability yet. It considers all data input to it. I mean, I guess there can be weighting on truth, as you have it, but that's an interesting notion that the data we feed it might not be true,
Yep, absolutely. There's the data we feed it, of course, has a huge impact. On the flip side, there's these really interesting studies that are exploring some of these. So I might get some of the details a bit wrong here, but the basic premise was they had 3 groups of doctors. One group just did their own diagnoses, and they gave them challenging diagnoses to figure out. The second group were assisted by like an LLM, probably ChatGPT, although I don't remember the specifics. And the third one, just ChatGPT, let's say. I'll say ChatGPT, but it could have been something else. Interestingly enough, the doctors that used ChatGPT did worse than than just using ChatGPT alone. And the reason was that they thought they knew better than ChatGPT. When you gave it good input, factual information, right, they'd see it and go, nah, I don't think it's that, right? Which is really interesting. It's similar to the transparency explainability debate. There was another paper written about this where same kind of thing happened. People think they know better, right? As opposed to, look, we should have expert in the loop. We're not at a stage yet where you just, use ChatGPT. I've seen it. I've seen where the prompting, which my analogy for like something like a large language model is treat it like an undergraduate student. Okay, I know some of the more advanced ones now, they're like graduate level, but just treat it like a student. And I don't mean any offense to students because I was a student as well, but I always think I've had a lot of co-op students, and I think, look, that's just going to sound terrible. I can't believe this is being recorded. But they lie, they cheat, and they're lazy. Okay, that was kind of my rule. That's how I treat ChatGPT. It's not the Harvard student. It's an average student, okay? And look, at the end of the day, you give them a problem, and they're used to having very well-controlled questions where there's a known answer. I had a math professor when I studied math. He said, look, I'm telling you this is provable. Go write the proof. Half the problem is done. Right? You give a real world problem to a co-op student that comes in and works with you, and they don't know that the answer exists, right? And so they just make stuff up. They do the best they can, and then you got to guide them. So I think it's kind of the same thing in a way. Anyway, I'm going a little off topic there, but yeah, the input's going to be important. You can create really good framed questions like you would a student, give them very explicit, and that's what a lot of people are prompt engineering. I personally hate that term, but regardless, if you have well-structured, well-formulated questions, the LLM can actually say, that doesn't sound right. It sounds like they're lying. I've done it. I've constructed requests, prompts, whatever you want to call it, in such a way that it was actually be able to find the error in the input data itself, which I think is brilliant. Sometimes you have to ask for that, though. It's like I'm sure some of you have tried this. You ask it something and it finds an answer, and you say, but no, it's okay if there's no answer. And it says, oh, okay, because there was no answer. Like, why didn't you tell me that? But you got to explicitly say it's okay if it's wrong. And then you catch things like the patient that's giving false information, right? Which is pretty cool. Again, it's a big correlation engine, right? It'll infer, if you don't tell it, it's okay not to infer. Infer that there's nothing. Infer that it's a lie. So, we're still at the early days, but this is where it's really important that these agents or these large language models are very specific to the task, and we have experts that are building that. So I work with one of our large language model NLP experts is actually a medical doctor, right? So we do talk about these things, and we do think about, okay, how do we structure this so that we can catch those mistakes, essentially.
Great. Thank you. We only have 38 seconds left. But I do want to sum up by saying that I think that, we've kind of strayed outside of marketing, which is fine, to talk about that. But even in marketing, first of all, I want to follow up on marketing grade AI. I'm going to take that from here. But I think that, a lot of people, in other sessions have talked about the positive things we can do using AI. What I kind of take away from this discussion is it might require, because the use of health data and even talking about health is not only an ethically sensitive question, but a legally sensitive question. These new technologies are going to increase the rate that we as vendors or people that do this work can defend our work, in a transparent, accountable way, and we barely are there with the data privacy issue, and I think this AI issue, the defensibility of AI, even applied to something like marketing, is going to be very needed in the next year or two. So, with that, we thank you very much for attending. We appreciate it. Have a good day.